Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, experienced scientists, serial entrepreneurs, and biotech investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup. Gain actionable insight into navigating the life sciences industry in each episode as we explore the business of science from pre-seed to IPO with your host, John Chi.
In our last episode, we spoke with Sandy Paige about his time working at the Jackson Laboratory, how to get started with business development, and what it was like starting his search fund. If you missed it, be sure to go back and give part 3 a listen. In part 4, we chat with Sandy about finding, purchasing and operating Explora BioLabs, getting acquired by Charles River Laboratories, and how humility, hustle, and a good team are at the core of his success.
You reached out to a previous customer and you quickly found alignment at Explora. Can you give the listeners just kind of what, I realize, this was, you're speaking back from when you were running it, but what was Explora's mission and focus, and what was the kind of the state of the market and Explora's approach to the market?
So on one hand, Explora was something that was not all that unique. It was a small preclinical contract research, in vivo contract research lab. I mean, we would run studies for clients in mice or rats. But it did a couple other things that were a little more interesting. And that business in itself is a fine business, but it's a very hard business to run profitably and consistently. But they also staffed vivariums for people. So that's sort of, while it sounds like it's fancy, it's really technical staffing, skilled technical staffing. And that's a huge, huge industry, right? And then the other thing, so 3 things: contract research, technical staffing, and this strange new thing, which was basically building vivariums, research laboratory space, chopping it up into small rooms and renting individual rooms to individual clients. So they didn't have to build their own vivariums, which is a very expensive thing for them to build that they need for only a short period of their lifespan. It made much more sense to rent it. But at this stage, this space now is probably $150 million a year in TAM today. Then I think it was 2025, and we had the biggest market share of it. We had bought 7 facilities, 5 in San Diego when we bought it, and 2 in San Francisco. And our largest competitor had a couple or a few. They were quite a bit smaller. But I recognized in that part of the business was interesting. It was interesting because there was a real estate aspect to it that was a different kind of business, with a facilities management aspect to it that was different. There was a real shortage of this space at a time of a boom that was different. And it was differentiated. In other words, if you did this well, you were creating a moat that was very hard for somebody else to come in and copy. And it became clearer as we began to expand that there was also something different about it, which is that the financing of the growth of that piece of the business could happen from our landlords. So the way it would work we would sign a lease with a landlord, pick one: Alexandria, Biomed, Longfellow, Breakthrough, any one of the big guys. And we would sign a lease and build out 10,000 square feet of $800 a square foot type TIs. Very often, anywhere from all to most of that TI growth capital, tenant improvement dollars is what I'm talking about, would come from the landlord, because the landlord would want us in that space as an amenity for the rest of their tenants. So that the growth capital could be provided through the leasing mechanism, and that worked out. That ended up being fundamental. Otherwise, we would have needed $100 million of equity that we never had to raise. So when we sold the business, it was $100 million of sort of capital, if you will, tied up in the leases. And leases, this isn't particularly novel because leases always have some tenant improvement dollars kind of baked in. And typically in life sciences, there's more tenant improvement dollars baked into the leasing, into the lease. In our case, it was just doubled or tripled, because it was part of the incentive. So we truly had, what made it interesting was we had this true two-sided marketplace. We would build a facility and we would have clients who would rent the space and then buy additional services from us, like in a data center. They would rent servers or racks, and then the data center would provide additional services. It's the same thing in a good vivarium, on-demand vivarium. But the other side of the marketplace was the landlords who they weren't paying us necessarily, but they were providing financing for our growth that was non-recourse, subordinated, off balance sheet, and truly negotiable if it had to be. I mean, would you rather borrow money from a landlord and bake it into a lease or from a senior lender? I always knew that if I had trouble in a particular location because we bet on a landlord and the facility was empty, I could go to the landlord and say, I'm taking my equipment and my people out of there and I'm going over to there where I have a full facility. And the landlord would be in a real pickle because they needed us in that building in order to attract new tenants. So I always felt there was going to be negotiation available there if we ever needed it, in a way that there isn't with your banker.
Yeah.
So or Exceeder.
Yeah.
Sorry. So that was the business, and that was the thing that we were doing. That when we just didn't break that, we didn't change anything fundamentally about it. We just poured gasoline on it and did as much of it as we could. Went from 7 facilities to we basically sold 18 facilities with a pipeline to 25 by the time we sold out. And now I think all in, there's probably 50 facilities like that in the market in areas of biotech density. So that means San Diego, San Francisco, Boston. That's where most of it is. A little bit in New York, a little bit in Research Triangle, and then in Seattle. That's kind of tier 1, tier 2, and then tier 3, you might say Chicago, Houston, a couple LA, a couple other places that kind of want to be biotech hubs and are working to become more relevant.
That's super fascinating. It's just very kind of out of the box financing strategy that I think, like we were just talking about it like before, what is a search fund? It's kind of, they're in the life sciences, everyone is accustomed to venture capital. But this is like another form of growth capital that isn't in the form of equity, but it is kind of like this this positive feedback loop that just continues.
Well, there were a couple people who recognized that there was capital available from the landlords early on, and I was one of them. But there were others on my cap table who saw it too. Really, it was initially like anything born out of necessity. Wanting to do facilities, talking to landlords and saying, that's just going to be too expensive. And if you haven't got anybody there for us to sell to, I'm not going to sign a lease. And so they would say, well, what if we provided more capital? Would you sign a lease if we put $800 in? Would you sign a lease if we provided the whole facility? And the answer then became, well, sure. We would do that. Now, I had this conversation recently with somebody. Even saying that now sounds just absurd. Like, of course you'd sign that lease. So you could be crazy not to sign that lease. I was terrified the first handful of leases we signed. Even if the capital wasn't ours, we were signing up for a 10, 12, 15-year lease. Just for the rent, it's millions of dollars. And I didn't have a client, initially for some of these locations, and I didn't know that they were going to appear. So in the end, we settled into sort of a pattern of kind of rules which needed to be satisfied in order for us to sign a lease where we got better at it and more comfortable mitigating our own risk. But these leases are expensive. These spaces in places like Torrey Pines or, God forbid, Kendall Square. It's $120 a square foot. $120 in Kendall Square, I think, is cheap these days. Per square foot. And those are all now overbuilt. I think it's a whole nother question about what life sciences is doing right now, particularly the real estate side of it. But that's probably for another podcast.
I mean, that's incredibly fascinating. And I think, a lot of things that Exceeder does to this day was born out of necessity. And just like having finite capital, like early days. And it really just forced you to find ways to, solve it unconventionally, solve the problem unconventionally. And it wasn't just even that unconventional solution wasn't a flash in the pan either. It's things that are baked into the DNA of the org, that we do it this way, that continue to serve us. And it also is a differentiating aspect. We're talking about kind of what are these competitive advantages or moats. And it's kind of these weird unconventional things that you do that keeps you from becoming a commodity. Versus just textbook says do this, so we're doing this. Everyone's got the textbook, they're going to see it and they're going to do it. So your competitor's going to do it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this was like a huge unlock. And basically you just were like, it's time to grow. Let's do this thing. And from there, you kind of, what was the growth strategy? It was kind of with the combination of BD, sales, and go, or was it something different?
No, it was all of that. And it was being acutely aware that every lease we signed was a long-term fixed cost. And so we were being what I felt was very conservative about how we would proceed. And so eventually we wouldn't sign a lease unless we had an anchor tenant.
Yep.
Who was basically covering the bulk of the dollars that were wrapped up in a lease. And if you can do that, you feel much better about it. And then you'll take a risk on the rest of the space. And generally, by the time we were opening these facilities, which took 12 to 14 months to build from the moment you sign a lease, we were generally opening them full. So that was sort of a sign that we probably didn't build big enough. But also it kept us profitable, and it kept our gross margin high, and was sort of a reassuring sign to investors that we weren't overbuilding. Nothing is worse than building a facility that's too big and having it rattle around being empty and sucking cash every month on these very expensive leases. $120 a square foot, 10,000 square feet is expensive. So it's 120 grand a month of rent, and it's a big nut to cover. And if that facility is empty for very long, it doesn't take much. It shows up in your occupancy and it shows up in your gross margin. And we had a sense that we were being watched as a potential acquisition target, and that we never really could take EBITDA down to single digits in order to kind of grow. And we were going to maintain profitability because we felt like this bubble could pop, and we wanted to make sure we weren't out in front of our skis. I think generally speaking, that's what a good board will do, is they'll keep a CEO who thinks he's got a tiger by the tail and wants to pour gasoline on everything from lighting himself on fire. And my board was very good at that. And that's what they're there for.
Absolutely. It's funny because I just thought of Jeff being on our board. Sometimes I'm in the growth mindset, and he does a perfect job of, sometimes, not all the time, he's not always does this, but he'll throw ice on it. And it's like, okay. And that is exactly what you want in a board member, is to have that healthy tension. And you mentioned you kind of felt that there was a potential acquisition on the horizon. Now we know it's Charles River, but what led up to the acquisition? And how did that really come about?
I mean, I knew those guys. I've known those guys because if anybody has been sticking with this podcast long enough, at this point, they heard us talking an hour ago about the distribution partner that I had for the Jackson Laboratory, which was Charles River. And so the senior people at CRL were people I knew and I built a relationship with, and they were our biggest competitor as well. So they did this thing called on-demand vivarium. Theirs was called Cradle, but they didn't do quite as much of it as we did. I don't think they did it quite as well, but they're very good at what they do, and they're $12 billion market cap. And so I always had a sense that if they decided they really wanted to be in this space, that we might be in trouble. In trouble in the sense that landlords had been giving us these leases and putting their capital into these leases because we were the ones showing up and knocking on the door and saying, we'll sign it. When it came in a couple of locations where I really wanted a location and Charles River really wanted it too, we didn't get it because there isn't a landlord in the world that won't give it a lease to the larger company with a real credit rating. Who, by the way, I'd say I want you to shove $800 a square foot and TIs into my 10,000 square foot facility. CRO would say, how about you shove $100 in? We'll provide the rest of the capital, make it a 20,000 square foot facility, and we'll sign a 15-year lease. And the landlord's like, yes. And that happened twice, as I sort of recall. And I had a sense that they were getting really serious about the space, and they could win that way by winning the best locations, and that they could have won. And I really wasn't going to be able to compete against that. I could raise all the equity in the world, and it wouldn't be enough to compete against a $15 billion market cap. The second thing they could do is ruin pricing, if they decided to ruin pricing. And I couldn't have done anything about that either. That would have been a very difficult thing to compete against because they really were the 1,000-pound gorilla. And if they decided to do both those things, that was going to force us to pivot into growing in the other two things we did, which were much less attractive businesses. While it might have been just a fun business to run for many years or forever, and we would have competed and we would have held our own and we would have won our fair share, I think getting to the kind of valuation that was put on the table was going to be hard, particularly if, for example, the bubble had popped and venture capital dried up for a few years, or life science overbuilt. And this was all, I'm talking about 2 years ago, when none of those things had happened yet, but happened kind of the month after our closing. Both of them did. And so I think it would have been quite a while before we could get back to the same valuation. But it's a hard decision because, I was having a ball. I had the best team anybody could have had. We all had fun and we all respected each other. We loved hanging out with each other. We loved working together. We loved hustling. We loved beating our competitors. And, we're sort of on the top of all of our games. And so that's really hard to walk away from. And certainly my investors, we were the highest performing asset they had in any of their portfolios. So they were like, what the hell are you talking about selling? Like, why would we sell? This is you hold forever.
Yeah. The wind is at your back. Just keep going.
Exactly.
Yeah, keep going.
So it took some convincing of the story I just kind of told to say we're a lot more vulnerable than you think, and let's be sure we weigh this seriously. And in the end, we did, and we had so little equity in the business that the investors were really looking down the nose of a really big gain in terms of a multiple of invested capital. So they made the right decision for them. It was the right decision for me as an individual, and I think fortunately it was good for the senior team as well. And long term, it's probably better off. It's certainly better off for the rest of the organization, because while they lost some of the entrepreneurship, they gained some stability by being within the sort of 1,000-pound gorillas organization.
Absolutely. And for any listeners out there that are exploring a potential acquisition, and I realize there is no tip to rule them all, but it sounds like from what I'm hearing, the acquisition is having a very holding a critical eye to where you're at in the market sounds super important, and it also sounds like a very personal decision too. Are there any other tips that you could provide for anyone who may be embarking on this journey and entertaining a potential acquisition?
It's such a deeply personal question. I guess what I'd say is take your time with it. Don't rush into it. I think the answer may be, under the same circumstances, had I been 43 instead of 53 or 2 or whatever I was, I might have come out a little differently, and I would have had 10 years to kind of throw myself at it. But having been a little bit older, having already, honestly buried one wife, and was lucky enough to be as lucky the second time as I was the first time. I wasn't going to waste. I wasn't, I was going to bank it and make sure that I had time to enjoy sort of the rest of my life. And I just didn't have high confidence that if I threw myself at this thing for another 10 years and wasn't as lucky as I had been professionally with it, it could be 10 years and we could be getting the same outcome. Perhaps even worse, if we'd had to raise more money along the way or raise debt instead of leases. There was sort of a moment in time where the equity takeaway from this particular investment was sky high, and it really did have a sense that it was more likely to go down in the next 3 years than up. And so I think just those things that I just mentioned are deeply personal. And I wouldn't begin to tell anybody else how they should view it. I just would tell them to take their time with it and don't rush into anything. You'll get to the right decision if you take your time with it.
Yeah. And I think this rings true to me. It's just like business is personal. As much as you want to one would want to sanitize it, and it's like, it's a spreadsheet. Not so simple. Yeah. Not so simple. Not so simple. And as you're, if you're thinking back on this, the journey up till now, what would you attribute your success to if you really had to distill it down? And is there anything that you would have done differently?
I think the things that keep returning whenever I've answered a question like this are kind of humility, admitting that, knowing what you don't know, or admitting that there's lots of things you don't know, and that's okay. Team, because that's how you mitigate the first thing I mentioned, having a great team around you, and just the value of just good old fashioned hustle and hard work and work ethic. Give me a bunch of humble but smart, hardworking people, and we can do anything. You take the opposite side of each one of those three coins, get me out of there, right? No interest in being a part of that. I'm sure those teams are successful. I know they are, but God, I wouldn't want to be a part of any of them. And so I think that's, and particularly if you're in that environment, just surrounding yourself with interesting people, just pure interesting people with interesting backgrounds who have really good or what I call origin stories, where their story of how they got to where they are is actually required some real hustle, and they weren't given anything. I like a good origin story, and to surround myself with people like that. Because frankly, I don't have one. I'm just honestly a white kid from Maine who his parents paid for his college. Like I didn't have to hustle. I chickened out on becoming a doctor, as I told you, because it was hard to do physics 101. So I always had a sense I needed to surround myself. I was never the smartest guy in the room. That was borne out by all my grades. And I just had to surround myself with people who are smarter and equally hardworking. And so I think if you do that, you'll never be unhappy with what you do, and you'll probably outperform most people who are smarter but lazier, for sure. And I guess I would also say patience is important. There's a lot of times where as CEOs, we're biases towards action. Make a decision, even if it's not the right decision, make a decision. But I don't know. My experience has been that sometimes ambiguity is your friend. Sometimes doing nothing and sitting with something and letting it develop a little longer than you're comfortable allows the right answer to sort of bubble to the top. And particularly if you're surrounded by good people, what I found was I would hold back on telling people what the answer was. And this was in the most recent leadership experience. They would get there and they would probably go and do it before I had time to even tell them. And so sometimes doing nothing and letting it sit is the right answer, rather than stepping in, making the decision, checking that box, and moving on to the next one. You have to be careful with that, because there's a flip side to that. If everything on your to-do list is full of let's wait and see. But if you pick those carefully and you're thoughtful about it, I think it's an okay way to settle in. And so I guess that's the thing. I would say humility. I would say great teams. I would say being patient. And just hustle and hard work. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. That as you were kind of listing those kind of criteria, it's exactly when I'm thinking about, what an org that I would want to join. Like I try to build Exceeder the way as an org that I would want to join, and it's exactly that. And now, as I know the Seabright Fund is now the Seabright Ventures Fund, and then this, this is back again. What is in store for the Seabright Ventures Fund in the next year or two, and what's in store for you in the next year or two?
Yeah, it's still to be determined. Absolutely doing, like, I think it's important to pay it forward. The search fund community was very good to me, and it's full of unbelievably good people. So I've joined the investment side of the search fund community, and I've now got 15 or 20 searchers, people like me out there running around trying to find businesses, and have invested in many of them so far, and will continue doing that. It happens to be just a fantastic asset class, but it's also just a super interesting asset class full of really interesting people doing cool stuff that's all over the map. So it might be life sciences, somebody trying to buy a pallet company in the Midwest. I've got somebody trying to buy OBGYN clinics, just sort of everything across the map that we get to look at, and really smart people coming together to evaluate it and put equity to work behind smart people. That's the piece that I'm responsible for. My wife is responsible for the climate tech and climate and clean tech aspect of what we do. And she's, beautifully, unusually and beautifully qualified to do that. So we're lucky. It's a little bit of a family office. I don't know how you define those, but we are putting our own capital to work and joining others, the people who you respect. And that's kind of the way this whole network works, is people, a loose confederation assembles around an opportunity, and usually there's one or two people who know a lot more about it than others, and you lean on them for some of your diligence, and that tends to happen. And I tend to be that person when it's more science-y related. We sort of take it opportunity by opportunity. I have turned down a few CEO jobs already, and I think I will continue to do that. But I've accepted 4 or 5 board roles, and I think I'll continue to do that. I don't feel a need to go out and do the full CEO role again in the same way. At least I'm not going to roll it out, and who knows. But there's a lot of other fun things to do in this world, and discovering them and having fun with all of it. So taking it kind of year by year.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I would imagine it sounded like a very busy couple of years before. So I don't blame you for wanting to take your time with it.
It was a busy 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so.
Absolutely. And it's, kind of on the theme of paying it forward and paying it back. Just some closing questions here that I always like to round out. Would you like to give any shout outs to anyone who supported you throughout your career?
I think those people, if I've done my job right, those people know who they are. And some of the people I'm likely to want to mention are no longer here. And they certainly know who they are. So I don't want to start that, because if I start that list, it's going to take too long to answer. And I don't want to get into prioritizing people, some over others, because the context matters.
Absolutely. And lastly, if you could give yourself, your 21-year-old self, any advice, what would it be?
I'm going to give my 21-year-old self the advice I was given at 21 that I followed. That was exactly the right advice. And it was when I was graduating from Middlebury, and I had done an internship in Austria and spent some time with the president of the Salzburg seminar, who had previously been president of Middlebury. And as I was finishing up, I had lunch with him, and he said to me and to one other Middlebury grad who was there, sort of in response to that question, what advice would you give us? He said, just go out and find the most interesting people doing the most interesting things, who have the best kind of integrity you can find, and just work with them for some period of time. Like, just do that. Like, under what conditions would you ever regret that? I don't care whether you make money or not. Just go work with interesting people doing interesting things that have high credibility and integrity, and you'll never go wrong. And I think that's still true. And I pass it along and tried to live mostly by that. And maybe now in some ways I can do it more freely than I've ever been able to do it. But it's not bad advice for anybody at 21.
Totally. And I would take that advice if I was 21 years old. I'm taking the advice right now, and I'm not 21 years old. So
it's all yours, John.
Yeah. Sandy, thank you so much for your time. You've been incredibly generous, and I've loved hearing the story. What a kind of, serendipitous, just amazing coalescence of ups and downs, honestly. And that's what, I'm really grateful for your time here, and thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, glad to be here. It's always fun. It's always fun to talk about yourself. But no, it's fun to take pause and actually be forced to go back through it. So thanks for giving me that chance.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy.
Hope it's useful. It's useful.
I am sure it will be. And you mentioned other podcasts. I would love to have you again, when we can double click on a kind of another business topic. But thanks again.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. We hope you enjoyed our 4-part series with Sandy Paige. Be sure to tune into our next series, where we chat with Feng-Ru Lin, founder and CEO of Turtle Tree, a biotech company revolutionizing food for good. In 2023, Turtle Tree will release LF+, the world's first sustainably produced lactoferrin, made using cutting-edge precision fermentation technology. In the long term, Turtle Tree will deliver on its ambitious plan to bring cell-based milk to the world. Feng-Ru is an expert in sales and business development who leveraged her breadth of skills, pivoted into biotech, and founded Turtle Tree. Her experience assembling a dream team and finding a unique gap in the market to fill offers founders many valuable lessons to learn from.
The Biotech Startups podcast is brought to you by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Make sure to search for Biotech Startups Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and click subscribe. To learn more about our leasing program, visit our website, www.excedr.com. We provide research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support a path to exceptional outcomes. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The purpose of the Biotech Startups podcast is to provide general insight into the ever-changing world of life sciences through the experience of a variety of guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast are at the user's own risk. The views expressed by guests and any employee of Exceeder on the podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Exceeder or content sponsors. Any appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement or recommendation of any product, service, or entity referenced in the podcast by Exceeder or by its guests.